So I'm making this quick video to do an overview or a case study of the Aurora shooting in Colorado that happened on July 20th, this past Friday morning here in the United States in Colorado at 12:38 a.m. This chart here, this one here, is the chart of Aurora, Colorado at 12:38 a.m. the moment the shooting happened. This is the pretty close approximation of when he started shooting. He went into the theater before that and then went out to his car and then came back in a side door. The man, Holmes, this is his chart over here, and we're going to look at his chart in depth as well. But this is his, this is the moment that the shooting happened, July 20th, 2012, 12:38 a.m. This is his chart. He was born December 13th, 1987, and there's no birth time given. I have made this chart to be an Aries ascendant. I'm going to explain why. Even if it's not an Aries ascendant, you're going to see what triggered him to snap, if you might say, or to commit this act. Of course, there are a lot of conspiracy theories abound right now as well, people looking deeper into it, wondering how a poor college student could afford all this gear and armor and to booby trap his apartment with all this sophisticated equipment. Who knows? But regardless, we don't even have to look at all that. And in fact, a lot of it is shown. The intrigue and the mystery and the potential for things not being what they seem to be because of the Rahu influence. But we're going to look at his chart and then the chart of the moment and see how these things influence each other. You could even forget that it's an Aries ascendant right now because I'm going to talk about the ascendant as the last part of it. But the main things we want to look at is his chart and what was happening by transit with him on this day as well. So, really the Aurora chart is kind of uneventful. I mean, there weren't any big sensationalistic stories besides that. Of course, there is quite a bit of violence in the world right now, especially in Syria, in the Middle East. This is also happening concurrent. You want to look at things that are similar to certain events, and it's not like, sudden rampages are common right now. Not like they're always common, but when we look at this chart, there are definitely things that signify the potential. I actually even talked about this on the new moon forecast that I just did, where I talked about all of the planets are concentrated around 3 signs. You have all of these conjunctions. Those of you who get my forecasts know that I talked about this, and you can go back and look at it or listen to the forecast. They're all concentrated around 3 signs, which brings a strong Mars influence. And in fact, I shouldn't say that because the violence in Syria has really escalated since this latest new moon that happened. And you see, this was just after the new moon. That new moon happened. This was the day after the new moon that I'm talking about. And literally, this was the first lunar day. And, or had it become the second lunar day by then? This is, 13 degrees, so it had just become the second lunar day. But it's right after the moon, the sun and moon had come together. And it's very close to retrograde Mercury here. If you can't see this on your screen, Mercury retrograde is 1726, the moon is 1655. It's exact conjunction of the moon with Mercury retrograde, which right away shows not really thinking clearly with a lot of discrimination. We also have Mars-Saturn conjunction in Virgo, which is about purifying and destroying things that are making us weak. And then we also have Ketu-Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Taurus. And so all 7 of the starry planets are concentrated in just 3 signs, which gives a strong Mars potential. Again, I said this before the new moon, actually, in my new moon video. And, of course, the other things that are important, though, mainly in this chart, is this proximity of the moon to Mercury retrograde, because moon is always going to be the trigger, at least the daily trigger of what's going on. The moon is still dark, even though it's waxing, but it's very close to retrograde Mercury. The ascendant in Aurora, Colorado, at the moment that this happened, was Aries. Now, that actually had nothing to do with why I also think his chart is Aries, but it happens to be Aries. This is just scientific fact. When you draw up the chart of 12:38 a.m. in Aurora, Colorado, Aries was rising, and it was right in the middle of Aries, so it was Aries. When he bought the ticket and went into the theater, which would have been about 12 midnight, even while the shooting was happening, it was an Aries ascendant. So this is a strong Aries. Now, when you look at this event, the 7th house is hemmed between Mars and Saturn in the 6th and Rahu in the 8th. This is the most difficult part of the zodiac. And I don't mean Libra, I don't mean Virgo, Libra, Scorpio. I mean houses 6, 7, and 8. This is the death part of the zodiac. The 7th house is literally a marika or a killer house, and the 8th house is known as the house of death, the house of sudden shocking changes and transformations. And the 6th house is a house of fighting that often leads to violence. All of this is seen in this Aries chart. Of course, Aries is ruled by Mars, which is when we get frustrated, we can actually destroy something and kill it. Mars-Saturn conjunction shows that potential. Moon and retrograde Mercury in the 4th house, which is the house of feelings and the heart, shows that emotions were overwhelming the faculty of discrimination. Means emotions. The moon in Cancer was overwhelming the faculty of discrimination, which is Mercury retrograde in Cancer. As I've said, this Mercury retrograde is a difficult Mercury retrograde cycle because it's in Cancer, where we're already not thinking clearly. Just Mercury in Cancer is not good for communication and thinking clearly. Mercury retrograde in Cancer internalizes it and makes it even more emotional and more confusing. His behavior was very confusing. So this is that chart of the moment. Now let's put him in that chart of the moment. First of all, his moon is in Virgo, no matter what. Even if it was earlier in the day, the moon is in, his natal moon is in Virgo. His natal Ketu is also in Virgo. So when you move this, let's just forget about the Aries ascendant. Let's just look at everything else. So his natal moon was being influenced by Mars and Saturn. Mars has just gone over his natal moon, and Saturn had been there the previous couple years and was in the same sign. Not just the moon, but his moon Ketu. Ketu is also there. In his natal chart, he's got Sun, Saturn, Mercury very close together in the nakshatra of Jyeshta. Jyeshta is ruled by Mercury, and it's known as the star of warfare. It's ruled by Lord Indra, and it's at the end of Scorpio. Especially Saturn in his chart is Gandanta, Sandhi. It's at the very edge of the sign. So Saturn is 2939 in his natal chart. 2939 of Scorpio. Now here's the most important transit of the whole thing. Saturn, by transit, the natal chart, 29 of Virgo. So you might say, well, okay, so both Saturn in the sky and his natal Saturn are both at 29. Okay, so what? Well, so what? Saturn casts an aspect here as well. Saturn aspects the 3rd house in front and the 10th house in front. If you've done any studying with me, especially with my very specific timing systems that I teach all the time, I always say look at planets aspect by transit, especially outer planets by transit. This is a clear hit. Saturn 2914 Virgo in the sky, his natal Saturn 2939 Scorpio. Not only that, but it's at the Gandanta point. And this Gandanta point between Scorpio and Sagittarius is a very tricky one. It's one that has to do with a lot of potential violence and volatility. So natal Saturn in his chart, 2939, was aspected by transiting Saturn to the exact degree. So you have to realize this. This Saturn has gone over it once, the end of last year. It went retrograde back over it earlier this year, and now it's going back over it again. If you look into at the exact degree. If you look into his life, once we find the biography of his life, once we find out more about this person, you're going to see that he had some big changes during those times. When Saturn went into Libra, the end of 2011, when Saturn went retrograde and went back into Libra earlier this year, and now that it's moving forward again, obviously, he perpetrated a mass killing. So, beyond that, Rahu in the sky, 940, Rahu transited over all these planets since the middle of last year. Since the middle of 2011, Rahu has transited over Mercury, Saturn, and the Sun. When you look at his natal, I'm just showing the transits now, the sky, and how they influence him. I'm not even talking about his chart yet. I'm just talking about the transits. So he's got Mars has just gone over his moon Ketu. Saturn went over it the previous couple years. Saturn is aspecting his natal Saturn to the exact degree by transit. Also, Mars and Saturn are aspecting his natal Jupiter to the exact degree, pretty much. He also has Jupiter in Pisces. Again, forget the house right now, but just by sign, he's got retrograde Jupiter aspected by Saturn and Mars to pretty much the exact degree. So, the other important transit is he has Venus is exactly opposite his natal Mercury, and actually Venus and Jupiter and Ketu, obviously. I'm not going to talk about Ketu because Rahu is on it, but Jupiter, Venus are exactly opposite these planets as well, particularly close to his natal Mercury, and Venus especially, 2939. His natal Mercury is 2229, so less than 1 degree Venus is to his natal planets in Scorpio. So these are just transits. These are showing the energy that's really active in the sky at this local time and place relative to his inner environment. This is the outer environment that brought about this violence in his immediate place and presence, and this is his inner environment that it's being intersected with. This outer environment, this moment, is intersecting with this inner being, and you see how potent it is. In particular, the Saturn influence is huge. Saturn transits are big because it's gone back. This is the 3rd time as well. It went over it once, it went retrograde, and now it's hit it again, exact degree, and it's triggering this Gandanta, unstable Saturn in Scorpio in Jeshta. Now let's talk about why this is such a difficult Saturn and his natal chart, and why he personally has a tendency to this kind of behavior. Of course, to say he has a tendency to this kind of behavior is to say like hardly anyone has a tendency to go out and perpetrate a mass killing, but I'm mainly talking about the psychology underneath all of this. And I'll just flat out say, I think it's hard for any astrologer to predict that someone would snap and go this far. But when we look at his chart, you're going to see why this person could have, and especially why, in light of the fact that it's an Aries ascendant, and why I think it's an Aries ascendant. So first of all, when we look at this chart, let's look at this stellium of planets in Scorpio. 29, these are very close Sun, Saturn, Mercury conjunction, especially Sun, Saturn within 2 degrees. So Saturn's influence on the Sun creates a lack of confidence, a feeling of being like invisible, and like you can't express the power that you want to express, that you innately feel. In Scorpio, it becomes very emotional, it becomes very stuck and concentrated, stuck in this feeling and this pain and this sort of paranoia about it. These imagined fears about what it's going to mean. Well, I'm not strong, I'm not powerful anyway. So it could lead to a huge escape into some kind of fantasy. It could. Doesn't necessarily, but you look at the house placements and all that stuff to see if that's possible. But just assessing the nature of this Sun-Saturn conjunction shows lack of confidence, stress and fear about it, and a lot of concentrated and difficult emotional energy that is hard to work with because of Scorpio. Fixed water, and a lot of imagined fears about it, also Scorpio. Additionally, it clouds the judgment and the discrimination because Mercury is there. The ability to consider more options and to be more intelligent, to have more discrimination, to be more, to be able to laugh about it a little bit more, to consider that maybe there's another way out rather than just being stuck with this emotional problem, which is the problem of Mercury in Scorpio. It just becomes overwhelmed by the emotional, situation. Mercury does well in earth and air signs where it's flexible and practical. In Scorpio, it's not. And it's overwhelmed by this by the stress of this Sun, Saturn, Mercury, Sun and Sun, Saturn. The other thing, another really important thing is this Moon Ketu conjunction. Moon Ketu, very much about sort of self-punishing on our emotions, very emotionally self-punishing, where the person, our emotions are unpredictable, they're messy, they're random, and Ketu is where we have no tolerance for that. Ketu has no tolerance for anything that's not perfect. So a person's like messy emotional state, when Ketu is there, it becomes very kind of punishing and strict and says, you should be able to handle that better. And the person, they can actually be very scientific mindset, very, very sensible appearing, especially because of Ketu's influence to want to really, in many ways, conceal and hide the emotional stickiness. Ketu hides things. And when someone has Ketu Moon conjunction, once you get to know them really well and you see their emotional state, you realize how unhinged emotionally they are, or they can be, because they hide it. Ketu hides things from themselves and from others. So Moon Ketu can have a sort of smoldering emotional volatility there. But it also makes for a very precise mental outlook and a kind of rigid mentality, very rigid mentality. This is aspected by retrograde Jupiter and Jupiter Rahu, which is called Guru Chandala Yoga. Now, this Jupiter is very philosophical. It has a lot of inherent confidence. It's easily the most confident planet in the whole chart because it's in its own sign. Anytime a planet is in its own sign, we're going to understand that thing and have a lot of confidence and have a lot of innate trust of what it's telling us. It doesn't mean it's always going to give us the right answer, but we're going to trust it. And often it will give us the right answer, but if it's hammered to death by malefic influence, it might not, especially if there's not a lot of other planets that are in good dignity, which in this case there aren't. This Jupiter is retrograde and it's with Rahu. So Guru Chandala Yoga means the person will absorb bad teachings, basically. Rahu means corrupt, has a corrupting influence on Jupiter because Jupiter is pure and sattvic, and Rahu is about randomness, gathering a lot of information, and a sort of poisonous quality that comes from not taking things seriously. And this spoils the wisdom and the philosophical virtue of Jupiter, which is to try to connect us to a righteous teaching, to a good teaching. And let's be flat out, anyone who goes on a mass killing, there's some kind of philosophy behind it. There's something philosophical behind it because no one thinks they're going to go out and do something terrible. We all have some kind of philosophy like this is, they're hopeful about it. They plan it and they have this big idea about why they're doing it. And it's a corrupt philosophy, obviously. Jupiter, Rahu, retrograde Jupiter in Pisces joined Rahu. So he has this mindset of being very philosophical, trusting his philosophies and his ideas about them because it's in Pisces, but it's retrograde and it's with Rahu, so it's a poisonous kind of philosophy. This is opposite Moon Ketu, Moon in Virgo, which is very precise, very thought out. This is a Gajikeshara Yoga, although it's not in angles, but it is Jupiter in an angle from the moon, which gives a very hopeful kind of psychological profile. Now, the reason I looked at Aries as the ascendant has to do with a couple things. First of all, this person is a scientist. There's a couple things that scientists, and especially his type of scientists, are strong at, and one of them is research. And Saturn, Mercury is really good for research, especially Saturn, Mercury, the 8th. You put the sun in the 8th. My first instinct with this was this stellium goes into the 8th house. That was my first instinct, not only because of that research, but also because the Saturn aspect by transit, it would make really good sense if this Saturn was aspecting Saturn in the 8th, and all these planets were in the 8th house. Also, just sensibly, it makes sense that a person who would do this would have a lot of Aries nature, not because of the ascendant, but just because this is very Aries type of activity. I'll go impulsively go on a shooting rampage. But it also does a lot of other things. It puts this Jupiter-Rahu in the 12th, which is not thinking clearly, Moon-Ketu in the 6th, and the Mars, the ruling planet, in the 7th. And all these planets in the houses 6, 7, and 8, which is this difficult section of the zodiac. I don't know if that's the case, but it makes a lot of sense. The other thing that it does, and here's the dashas, is it puts his Rahu dasha starting around middle 2008, but then Rahu Jupiter starting, and has him in Rahu Jupiter dasha right now. So Rahu dasha starting around 2008, and then Rahu Jupiter. Jupiter is the ruler, of course, of the Rahu. It's also the ruler of Venus, which is a Marika, a strong Marika or killer planet for Aries, because it rules the 2nd and the 7th house. The other thing I forgot to mention about the transits is there's a double aspect here. Jupiter, actually I did mention it, but one thing that needs to be understood about planets by transit, aspects by transit, is you look for wherever Jupiter and Saturn are casting a double aspect. There's always signs where Jupiter and Saturn, based on their special aspects or 7th house aspects, are casting a double aspect. And right now it's on Scorpio. Jupiter's aspecting Scorpio to the 7th house, and Saturn is aspecting Scorpio to the 3rd house, like I already mentioned. So the double aspect of Saturn and Jupiter by transit is also really important, and they happen to be hitting his 8th house. If it's a Aries ascendant, maybe it's not, but my feeling is he actually looks like Aries as well. And so, to summarize the nature of this person and why I think it's also Aries ascendant is you would have this Mercury, Sun, Saturn in the 8th house, which is a placement of a scientist. It has a scientific bent to it. Is Mars dasha, Moon dasha, Mars dasha. Mars is in an angle, it forms Raja Yoga. Here, Mars dasha, he was pursuing a life of a scientist and whatnot since 2001, which would have been since he was, since he was 14 or whatever. And up until the time he was 21, then he goes into Rahu dasha in 2008, and things change. Although Rahu has joined Jupiter in Pisces, Rahu Jupiter would be very difficult because it's his retrograde Jupiter. It's the ruler of the 12th. It's also the ruler of this Venus, the ruler of this Marika planet. By aspect, we have this very powerful and concentrated and direct Saturn aspect onto this Gandanta Saturn in Jeshta. All these planets in Jeshta Nakshatra in his 8th house. I think his 8th house getting triggered. I want to stress, this is not an insignificant transit. This is going to happen like a couple times in his life. A major transit here to a direct aspect. And this is why you pay attention to the special Vedic aspects, and it's why I use them, and especially the special aspects, not the 7th house aspect by transit. I've said this also, I've stressed it every class I've ever taught on how to make predictions. It's the special aspects of the planets that have the most impact, the special aspects of the outer planets. The other thing is if it's an Aries ascendant, I forgot to mention, I almost forgot, Mars by transit is aspecting his ascendant, because Mars casts an aspect in the 4th house and the 8th houses. If it's an Aries ascendant, then his ascendant is getting an aspect from Mars. And by the way, the local chart is already getting the aspect by Mars, and it's a direct, immediate aspect. I want to point this out. I almost forgot. Mars aspects the 4th house and the 8th house in front. So Mars, in the local chart, is aspecting 15 degrees of Aries. Mars is aspecting 15 degrees Aries. The ascendant was 1329 Aries. You think aspects by transit aren't important? Mars was aspecting the 8th house as well. these aspects by transit are really important. Look at the Mars aspect by transit on the local chart that we know, and look at the Saturn aspect by transit on the chart of the perpetrator, exact to the degree. Astrology works precisely when you know what you're looking at and you know how to prioritize all these things. Special aspects have more weight. And so, anytime I've seen, I have to just say this, and I don't want to knock a lot of astrologers, but I've seen a couple astrologers come out and just be like, you just can't see this stuff in astrology. It's bigger than astrology. You'd never be able to predict this or whatever. Or you just can't. It's just the guy was just a kook. So let's just forget the astrology now. Whatever. Okay. I understand. And I even said at the beginning, I'm not saying that I would have looked at this chart and said, this guy's going to perpetrate a mass killing. But I'll tell you this much. If he'd have come in for a reading and I'd have looked at these transits, I would have said, dude, you're under enormous stress right now. Do not do anything. I mean, you're probably having a lot of crazy ideas right now, a lot of crazy feelings. Look, he's got Sun and Saturn, Mercury right at the end of Scorpio in the 8th house, if it's the 8th house. Even if it's not, at the end of Jyeshta Nakshatra, Guru Chandala Yoga, Moon Ketu. This person is very, very severe in his own mind, very punishing of himself, and very philosophical, but doesn't know how to bring it about. This person probably wanted to really do a lot of good in the world. With his Jupiter in Pisces, you better believe it, but it's retrograde and it's with Rahu, so it gets distorted and disturbed by the nature of the world. Mercury, Sun, Saturn, also difficult. So I don't want this to go on forever, but I think this was an interesting case study, and my heart goes out to all the victims, of course. This is a terrible, terrible tragedy, and I don't make these videos to try to get any glory, or I don't have any, I don't have any good feeling about, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to show how smart I am. No, but these things are opportunities for us to learn about what makes astrology work at a high level. And obviously when we have these kinds of events, you're going to see it in the astrology. You're going to see it clearly looking at the chart of the moment. And we had a good chart of the moment, and you see, we have a very good, accurate chart of the moment, and it's obviously right. And how that intersects with this person, even though we don't have his birth time confirmed, my hunch is that it's Aries. That makes sense, but again, I'm not swearing on that. But either way, we would have these dashas similar, especially if it's around, especially if it's around 12 to noon or something like that. The dashas are going to be changing so that he's in Rahu Jupiter now.